Okay, so going on to the 1960s. And beginning with the United Farm Workers. You'll recall when I talked about World War II, that is when the United States and Mexico came to an agreement for the Bracero program, a program that was intended to only be during World War II, ended up getting extended all the way until 1964. Now, the agriculture industry, it lasted that long because the agriculture industry would lobby to renew it year after year, all the way to 1964. With that said, there was also a growth of, let's see, there was also, well, to connect it to the United Farm Workers, there were Mexican Americans that were working in, and different groups, especially Filipinos, especially in the case of California. Filipinos and Mexican Americans made a good percentage of the people that worked in farm labor. But as long as the Bracero program existed, their working conditions could never improve because they could, if they ever complained that they weren't getting paid enough or that they weren't treated well or, sort of in hazardous working conditions, they could just be threatened with being replaced by braceros. So when the Bracero program ended in 1964, that created an opportunity to finally be able to improve their working conditions in 1965. And that's what happened. In Southern California, in 1965, Larry E. Leong and other Filipino farm laborers started going on strike. They went on strike for higher wages and better working conditions. What are some examples of the types of working conditions that they were unhappy with? One of them was what was referred to as a short handle hoe. The short handle hoe was a short stick working instrument that meant that people had to be bent down all day with their back bent, kind of working the soil. And that led to a lot of back pain and back problems, back injuries. Another thing is there's a lot of basic labor rights that farm laborers never got as part of the New Deal back in the 1930s. They were excluded from minimum wage. They were excluded from a lot of requirements, like that employees should have a bathroom available to them. A lot of things that we consider very basic assumption, we just assume people have the right. Well, those rights, farm laborers were excluded from those labor protections that other workers got from the 1930s and the New Deal. Sexual harassment. There were no or very few sexual harassment protections. And, that could be true about labor, kind of employment in general in the 1960s, and even worse in farm labor. There were issues with pesticides, where there would be pesticides put on the crops that would hurt the health of the workers. There were examples of farm workers or farm worker communities having cancer rates that were 1,000% higher than people elsewhere in that area. And they couldn't prove it, that it was due to the pesticides, because in order to prove it, you needed multi-decade studies to prove it. And so, yeah, there's that. And then again, very basic things like being able to, if you work out in the hot sun in California, in the summer or whenever, you know, having a right to clean water to drink and shade. Very basic things that, yeah, you know, they're asking for very basic things. So they started going on strike, wanting better contracts, wanting some benefits, better pay, better treatment, better conditions, the possibility of health insurance, that kind of thing. So Larry E. Leong and Filipino workers started organizing in Southern California. They started organizing in particular with grapes and the grape crops. Now, kind of with farm work, there tends, all right, so kind of the way that agriculture industry works, or one part of it, is that crops ripen first in the south, and then they start ripening north and north and north. So people who work in farm work have a lot of instability in their lives because they can't stay and live in the same place. They have to migrate to where the crops are ripening, and they end up working, like a lot of the farm workers that come to Wisconsin would start working in Texas, work their way north to Minnesota and Wisconsin. A lot of the first Mexican farm work that came to Wisconsin started coming in large numbers in the 1950s. And so, yeah, they tend to go from south to north. And so that's kind of how it works. So they started organizing in Southern California. When they got to Central California, they encountered larger Mexican-American farm work labor. And those Mexican-American farm workers had to decide whether they were going to join the Filipino workers or become what they call scabs, you know, strike breakers. You know, where with a strike, they ask people to leave the job site, and that's a way of pressuring the farm owners to concede to their demands. Otherwise, because the crops, if you don't pick them at the right time, they can go to waste, and then they can lose their whole crop. And so it's an important moment at which to pressure the farm owners or the agribusiness companies to give them some better treatment. Some of the early unions or that organized were the AWOC and the UFWOC. This is the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee and the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee. They both came together to create the United Farm Workers. They started with grape strikes, but the farm owners would bring in strike breakers. They would bus in workers from elsewhere. They had a lot of, I don't know, just power. Like in Central California, for example, all right, so again, with a strike, people leave the job site, and then they might picket, you know, with signs, trying to get the other workers to also leave the job site so that you have an effective organizing. So one example was in Central California, they would pass laws that said that you could not picket within something like 50 to 75 feet of the fields that you're picketing. Well, there were examples where the farm owner would own both sides of the street. So in order for them to, they couldn't officially, legally say picketing is illegal because we have our First Amendment rights. But instead, they would say you can't picket within X number of feet. And I think it was something like 50 or 75 feet. And so in those cases, in order for them to legally picket, they would have to either be in the middle of the street or sometimes suspended up in air in the middle of the street in order to be able to meet the guideline of being 50 to 75 feet away from the field. And so there were all these legal ways in which the owners could use their power, their networks to get to defeat them. So then instead they turned to boycotts, where they would instead instead of picketing and striking on location, they would go out to supermarkets and try to inform the public and the buyers, the shoppers, to let them know about how farm workers were being treated and to discourage them from buying a specific product or a specific brand of product, so that to help them win their strike. Cesar Chavez is the most well-known Mexican-American civil rights leader, period. And I've mentioned in previous lectures that he got a lot of his training with the Community Service Organization, the CSO, which was the most important organization for Mexican Americans in the 1950s. Then he went on to become director of the CSO in California and Arizona. Then he co-founded the National Farm Workers Association so that with Dolores Huerta, so that they could focus more on the issues of farm workers. And he was a founder of the United Farm Workers, of the UFW. His influences included Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. And one of the ways they influenced them was to improve society with nonviolent civil disobedience. And so that included things like strikes, boycotts that I've already talked about, both of these. Another form of nonviolent action would be fasts, where he would, especially when things would start getting tense and people wanted to start getting violent, he would say, okay, we need to pause here. I'm gonna do a fast where I'm not gonna eat or drink anything other than water and what do you call it? The host of when you do communion at church. That would be, and so yeah, that's how he would fast. They would have masses. They would have marches. And so yeah, like one march, for example, was from Central California to the state capital in Northern California, Sacramento. And every morning would begin with a mass before continuing this long multi-day march to get to the state capital. Dolores Huerta was just as important in every respect, if not more, than Cesar Chavez. She also got her training with the Community Service Organization. She was also a founder of precursors to the United Farm Workers, like the Agricultural Workers Association and the National Farm Workers Association. And then the actual UFW, she was a co-founder and vice president. For too long, she was an unsung hero. I think in the 1960s, she was an unsung hero just because she was a woman. At the time, people looked for men, just assumed there would be a man who was the leader. And so then he's the one that would be given more recognition and sort of speaking opportunities, not to mention he was the president while she was the vice president. In more recent decades, like for example, Cesar Chavez passed away in the early 90s. I think it was 1993. And when he passed away, he was still organizing farm workers. He was organizing farm workers in Arizona, and he did a fast. And when he did this fast, he hurt his health permanently. And he's believed to have died from the complications that came from doing that fast, where he hurt his health permanently. And so him passing away because of that also helped make him a martyr, where people just kind of saw him as a saint, someone who died fighting for what he believed in a very nonviolent way, where he caused harm to himself rather than to anyone else. So I think those are all factors in why Dolores Huerta was overshadowed, even though she was just as important, or if not more important, in every respect. Now, when Cesar Chavez died, and the board of the UFW didn't choose her to become the new president, she got understandably upset with the United Farm Workers and left the United Farm Worker organization. At that point, she created her own Dolores Huerta Foundation. That Dolores Huerta's foundation is still active today, as is Dolores Huerta herself. And yeah, they're still active. Let's see. So look, she's gonna turn 95. They're getting ready to celebrate her birthday. So it looks like they're talking about gerrymandering, they're talking about social justice, and they deal with a lot of different areas. Let's see, here's a picture of Cesar Chavez and Larry Itliong coming together to create the United Farm Workers. Here's how people would organize and picket right on the side of the fields. Huelga means strike in Spanish. One of their tools for organizing was theater. This is Luis Valdez, and he would help organize workers through theater. They would literally just get a truck, get up on the truck bed, and do theater as a way of educating the workers about what issues were, why they were organizing, how to react to different scenarios, kind of educate them on the issues. I guess here is the United Farm Workers protecting workers from the police in, when they come into contact with each other. And so, yeah, Luis Valdez led the effort to educate people through theater. He ended up creating El Teatro Campesino, Farm Workers Theater. Teatro Campesino, still active around today in Central California. He went on to be involved in important films, I think as producer for the movie Zoot Zoot and the movie La Bamba. There is a documentary that is part of that series that you already watched. You watched the one episode, Chicano, Quest for a Homeland. There's another one called Chicano, Struggle in the Fields, that is very useful for learning about the United Farm Workers. UWC also has a documentary called Luis Valdez and El Teatro on films on demand. If you, if you're looking to write about this topic for your research paper and want more sources. All right, we don't have time to move on to Tijerina. So I will stop there.